Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 6th live session of a Research Support Webinar Series 2022. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who made it today for this session. So without any waste of time, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Vinolia. I'm the Marketing and Event Coordinator for ISCA. I have along with me Dr. Retha Visagie. Before we go into that, I would like to take you through some housekeeping rules. As you all know, every house has some housekeeping rules, and I would like to urge everyone to please adhere to the rules so that we avoid any clashes or whatsoever. So I would like to request everyone to please mute themselves to avoid any disturbances or any background noise. And for those who have any questions during the session, you will write your questions in the chat box, and then I will take them through after the presentation. And for those who would like to present their own questions, you'll be given the platform to do so only after our guest speaker is done with the presentation. That's when you will be given the opportunity to present your own question. And by doing that, you will only raise your hand for you to be noticed, and then you'll be given the opportunity. So, like I said, today we do have our guest speaker, who is Dr. Retha Visagie. Dr. Retha Visagie is a founder member and the former chairperson of the Research Ethics Committee Association of Southern Africa's Executive Board. She is... Okay, can you please mute yourself, whoever is on unmute? Can you please mute yourself so that you don't disrupt the session? Thank you. Okay, like I said, today we do have our guest speaker, who is Dr. Retha Visagie, who is a founder member and the former chairperson of the Research Ethics Committee Association of Southern Africa's Executive Board. She is a non-executive director and the chairperson of the Ethics Expert Board of Directors. The goal of this non-profit company is to strengthen responsible and ethical research capabilities in and for Africa. Dr. Retha co-founded the Sarima Northern Regions Community of Practice for Research Ethics and Integrity and co-chairs the executive committee of this organization. She established the UNISA's Research Integrity Office in 2014 and serves in several national and international leadership positions. She is a GlobeEthic.net Global Pool of Ethics Expert member. She contributed to the formulation of research ethics and integrity guidelines for the Southern African Development Community in 2021, and she led the establishment of research ethics committees in both South Africa and abroad. She is an advisor of the UNISA Social and Ethics Council Committee and one of the UNISA's few privacy ambassadors. She is an international recognized certified virtue research integrity trainer and completed a course in compliance management at the University of Cape Town with a cum laude. As a Fogarty Fellow, Retha completed a postgraduate diploma in health research ethics with a cum laude in 2015 through the University of Stellenbosch. She is the 2018 recipient of the DST or Sarima Award for Professional Excellence in Research Management. Her research niche focuses on research ethics and integrity scholarship with a keen interest in contributing to the indigenization of these fields. She remains active as a postgraduate research supervisor. She is one of the co-editors of a book on social science research ethics in Africa and has published several peer-reviewed book chapters and articles in accredited journals. Since 2016, she has trained more than 2,500 academics and members of research ethics review committees as a sought-after research ethic facilitator. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our guest speaker, who is Dr. Retha amongst us, to take over the session. Dr. Retha, you are most welcome to continue with your presentation. And
thank you so much. Thank you for this very kind introduction. And I also want to thank Prof. Ambi and yourself for allowing me this opportunity to engage with my fellow scholars in this community to share some thoughts on a field that I really and truly care about, and that is qualitative research design specifically. And when you are asked to do a session on qualitative research designs and you get 1 hour to do it, obviously it would be important to reflect on what do you want to say within that 1 hour. How can you add meaning to the participants in the audience, and how can you convey a message that might be practical for them so that they can also have a take-home message from this engagement. So I pondered about this for some time, actually since you invited me to this very prestigious events that you are hosting. And I thought that it would be important to locate myself firstly and to share that I am a qualitative researcher, and I am qualitative because, or I ascribe to qualitative research because I love people. And I think often when we engage in qualitative research, we might be in a situation where we are often more influenced by our own personal preferences than at times by the relevant research problem that we face. This should not be the case. As you know, we will always teach our postgrad students and tell them that when you consider the research design, when you think about which design would be most suitable, you should actually be influenced by the problem that you are investigating or exploring. But I believe that we are often actually choosing a design because of a personal preference that we have. And I think all researchers, when you choose a specific design, should actually ask yourself why you are choosing that design. This is the first step in terms of being reflexive then as a researcher. What I want to share with you in this very short time span is to unpack what qualitative research would mean for a researcher. And I assume that many of the members or participants in this audience would be postgrad students. I've noted that this was also how the session was promoted. And hence, it is more of a basic session. However, I think the value of this session for each and every one of you will be to reconsider what it means to be a qualitative researcher. And also then, what would influence your choice to conduct a qualitative study? But most importantly, how do you show up as a qualitative researcher? And this is very closely related to the role of the researcher. I also plan to share with you a snapshot of qualitative designs and methods. This snapshot will be based on Creswell's work. As you know, Creswell speaks about the 5 qualitative approaches, and I've decided that it would be a suitable way of conveying the message to you that when you choose qualitative designs, it is important to understand the theoretical underpinning of those designs. I always lamented when postgraduate students do not truly engage themselves in these designs, and if they somehow miss out the underlying assumptions, because these assumptions are critical to guide your decisions throughout your research journey. And then I hope that I will be able to share with you one or two take-home messages. So let's start then at the beginning and ask ourselves, what is qualitative research? According to Creswell, I actually love reading the work done by Creswell because I believe that it is provided in a very simplistic way. It's very understandable. And it is true that Creswell provides us with a broad overview of these approaches, and that ultimately we will need to go to the gurus that are doing specific work in these fields. But I still believe that Creswell, this is now the latest textbook, provides a very good guidance. Now, in this textbook, the authors then define qualitative research as a way of exploring and understanding the meaning individuals or groups ascribe to a social or a human problem. In essence, qualitative research is more concerned with the process than the outcome. The outcome would be critical, but if you are not engaged throughout the process, you may actually not get the outcome that you should get. So in terms of the process, then qualitative research in essence is emerging. It's an emerging approach or emerging design. Your questions may emerge in the field. Your procedures may emerge in the field. It is an insider perspective position where you immerse yourself in the field or the context of your participants. You analyze data inductively, and at times you would also position yourself more inductively in this study. And the meaning of that would be that if we position ourselves more inductively, it means that we then start with the specific particulars of a problem, and we would then ultimately be able to transfer it to other contexts. So we do not start from the general as in quantitative research, but we start actually often focusing specifically on the problem that we have to deal with, and we at times even do our literature review slightly differently, where in quantitative research there's a high dependence on the literature. In some qualitative studies, you might even decide that you are going to extend your understanding specifically to contextualize your problem, but you may depend more on a literature control at the end of the study when you generalize your findings back into existing literature. I know that there is, in a university context, often a preference that students should do literature reviews, and I'm also requesting my students to do literature reviews. But I want to disclose that I personally, when I did my qualitative research, I did not start off with doing extensive literature reviews. I work predominantly inductively. And then also the importance of interpreting the meaning of the data. And when we engage in qualitative research, it can be quite taxing because we can expect that we need to deal with a lot of text and we have to generate meaning from that text. And then also you have to provide a final written report. But this report can actually be more flexible in terms of how it is presented. And if you consider again Creswell's work, he actually, when he describes these 5 approaches, he provides some guidance on how the writing structure might differ if you choose a specific approach. In terms of the positioning of the researcher then from a more inductive stance, I present to you here the research wheel. And in this research wheel, you will then note that if you depart from a qualitative and a more inductive stance, you will depend on your observations and on your data in the field. You will then move towards making sense of these data, to identify patterns in the data, and the ultimate outcome of a qualitative study is actually to generate theory. And from this theory, you may end with recommendations and with conclusions, and often you will be able at the end of a qualitative study to actually present hypotheses that can be explored in future research studies. It is important, however, to note that when we conduct research, whether it is qualitative, quantitative, or a mixed method design, you need to obey the rules of the scientific method. And the scientific method, as you know, are set out in terms of certain very important aspects of research. And it starts with that as a researcher, then you need to define your research problem, but also you need to provide very solid theoretical definitions if you focus on qualitative research. So what you would do when you craft your problem statement, you should ask yourself a few pertinent questions. And one of these questions would be, what is this problem? And if you ask this question, a good tip would be to see if you cannot write down your problem within 1 or 2 sentences, and then from there, ask some further questions. Why is this a question or an issue? For whom would it be a problem? If this problem is not addressed, what will be the outcome of this? If there is a solution to this problem, how can the solution then assist certain beneficiaries? How can it resolve certain issues? In terms of your concepts, critical then to engage in literature to review concepts and theories and previous findings. But I want to share again with you here that in qualitative studies, depending on your chosen approach, your literature engagement might be slightly different, specifically if you follow a more inductive stance. In all research, you will have either then hypotheses, but in qualitative research, you will have your research questions, because you are not going to generate hypotheses from literature. You need to describe the research framework in terms of the research tools, the sampling procedures, the data collection, how the data will be analyzed, how you will employ measures to ensure rigor. And then also you have to discuss the results. And in quantitative research, then testing of the hypothesis. So all studies must adhere to the rules of the scientific method. But how do we show up then as qualitative researchers? And first and foremost, if a student asks me what would be my one most important tip that I would give a student that plans to do qualitative research, I would say you have to understand the qualitative paradigm. What are the assumptions of the qualitative paradigm? What are the characteristics? Because remember that these assumptions align to the paradigmatic perspective that you will choose. will influence your decisions. As the primary instrument for data collection, you need to consider your role within within this process. What is the language that you are going to use? Will it be appropriate for you to indicate whether with, for instance, being more personal in terms of the pronoun that you use, that you are actually immersed in the field? What will be the nature of the research questions that you ask? I often note that when students present their qualitative research, they would have numerous questions. They often have close-ended questions. Close-ended questions are often opposing the characteristics of qualitative research. Also, think about it this way. If you really want to immerse yourself and really understand the experience of your research participants, can you, in an interview scheduled for 1 hour, ask them 15 questions? No, you cannot. And I am lamenting the fact that when students and researchers develop their research data collection instruments, specifically then an interview guide, you would often see 15 to 20 questions asked. These questions would often be close-ended questions. So consider the questions. And I always tell my students, you have your problem statement. From the problem statement, then you will have your research questions. Your research questions will probably not be more than 3 to 5, depending on the nature of the problem. From those 3 to 4 research questions, how can you then craft research or interview questions that will allow you to engage with the participants from an immersed perspective? Also, if you are doing qualitative research, remember that it is important to be prepared to address critique. And this is often then linked also to the inductive stance. I am currently supervising a student in accounting sciences, and I had a lovely face-to-face session with her and the principal supervisor last week. And when I suggested that she should refer to herself as I within this manuscript or in the research report, the supervisor said that in the field of accounting sciences, this is not always appreciated. So if the student wants to take this stance, she will need to justify her decisions from the very beginning. And you must justify your decisions by referring to reputable sources. So self-positioning in qualitative research is of the paramount importance. When we then consider a critique that you may get as a qualitative researcher, remember that conclusions that are drawn from observations or field engagements and not totally from an in-depth study of literature and previous research may be questionable, because the one question that can be asked is how many participants do you need to involve in your study to draw transferable conclusions then? Because in qualitative research, we prefer not to use the concept generalizable. We rather opt to say that we want to generate findings and conclusions that can be transferred to similar contexts. How much control do you have over the situation, and under which conditions were these engagements carried out to draw valid conclusions? So this is putting a demand on you as a qualitative researcher. You have to describe the context of the study very well. You need to carefully consider measures to ensure trustworthiness, because if you have a very well presented section on how you will use measures to promote the credibility and the reliability of your findings, you will be able to stand up to this critique. How will you deal with your own biases throughout the research process? Qualitative researchers must be reflexive research practitioners. So how do you do it? Will you depend on a reflective journal? Will you do field notes? And your field notes can consist also of personal notes. But important then, to also consider that qualitative research is in essence multi-method. And if you are, for instance, a master's student and you are considering your data collection methods, it's always, according to my view, a good strategy not to only focus on one specific data collection method, for instance, only interviews. Why not combine interviews with field notes, for instance? Sometimes you can utilize more creative data collection methods also. Another important question for you to show up as a qualitative researcher is in terms of your ethical considerations. Did you carefully consider the ethical considerations? And remember that because we are talking here of an emerging design, it is possible that you may enter the field and that you realize that there are certain risks of harm that you did not anticipate in the beginning of the study. And then you have to respond to that. What is also very important is to remember that if you choose a sensitive topic, and the sensitive topic is defined by Lee and Renzetti as one that potentially poses for those involved a substantial threat, the emergence of which renders problematic for the researcher and or the research in terms of the collection, holding, and dissemination of research data, you must consider the ways that you are going to mitigate these risks. It is important to note that when we do medium to high risk studies, and these studies could often then be linked to sensitive topics, we have to really engage with a risk-benefit analysis. I recently engaged with a student conducting a cannabis study. And when the student departed on this research journey, the student did not foresee the potential challenges that he might experience in terms of collecting data from participants. And some of these participants are currently engaged in activities that would still be viewed within the South African legal context as illegal activities. So how do you now protect yourself as a researcher from this situation? And how do you also protect your participants? And something that is quite important, if you deal with sensitive topics, do you have a distress protocol in place? And the distress protocol is a procedure that you can follow in anticipation of possible risks of harm. And this might, for instance, be when you deal with sensitive topics and a participant can become distressed during an interview. So you must consider these aspects and general guidelines for the stress protocols that students should include and researchers should include in their research ethics applications and also in their proposals refers then to interviewer competence. If you are doing research on sensitive topics, do you have the competence to do that? If you are a postgraduate student, can you argue that your supervisor is competent in this specific field? Are you able to monitor participants' emotional reactions well? Are you able to create a psychological safe space for data collection? How will you engage in debriefing activities if that is necessary? And also, if you provide information to participants informed by possible support after the data collection phase, for instance, psychological or social services, that you enter into an agreement with the service providers. So this is very important, because if we think about qualitative research is a way of positioning yourself. So if you position yourself very close up and personal with participants, and if you investigate or explore topics of a sensitive nature, it is obvious that it may create the stress for your participants. And what I find very disturbing is that researchers often do not really contemplate the possible risks of harm for their participants. They would often just indicate that there are no anticipated risks of harm without clearly conceptualizing or thinking about the types of risks of harm. Could there be, for instance, economic risks to the participants? In my study that I conducted as a team coach researcher within a specific business context, I was actually ultimately expected to also identify deadwood, because there was some role fusion between myself being a team coach, but also being a researcher in that context. Initially, when I planned this study, I didn't foresee this as a potential problem. So many of these issues might develop as you engage in your fieldwork activities. How else should you show up in the field? If you think about engaging with people, remember that you want to provide a holistic account of their experiences. You should also show up as a word artist, because you should be able to describe process, meaning, and understanding gained through words, images, pictures, the type of data collection tools that you opted to use. You must also display sensitivity for the context. And then, as I've said, consider employing multiple methods. This is one of the ways that you can provide evidence of the trustworthiness of your findings if you actually employed more than one method. And if I say method, it does not only refer to the data collection methods, but it also includes, for instance, the participants or the groups of participants that you will include in a study. If you, for instance, do a case study design, you might have various stakeholder groups of participants that would be valuable knowledge holders or sources of information. And we did discuss the importance then of reflexivity. If you are a supervisor, consider also how you can assist your students to become more reflexive. And one way that you can do that is to have reflexive conversations with students, where you ask them, for instance, if they have to answer the same research question, what would their answers be? Because if you do that in a way, you can elicit their already previously obtained ideas about a specific topic that they investigate. And this can assist them to actually put their own assumptions, their own beliefs about a specific phenomenon at bay. And in phenomenological research, we will talk about bracketing and how we basically take our own beliefs and we bracket that. And what we do with our own beliefs, instead of then influencing, for instance, participants when they share with us their life experiences linked to a specific phenomenon, we could use our own beliefs and our own ideas about a specific phenomenon to generate questions from that and to rather come from a more open stance when we then elicit data. You need to commit to extensive time in the field. If we consider measures of trustworthiness, this is also referred to as prolonged engagement. So how are you going to use prolonged engagement? And this actually starts when you initiate contact with your research participants, when you invite them to participate in the study. Are you going to only have one interview with them? Are you going to have maybe more than one interview with them? But that will definitely depend on the scope of the study. It will also depend on the type of design that you are choosing for this specific study. Flexibility is quite important. And as I've said, that it is important then to love what you do. You are going to spend a substantial amount of time on your in this research journey, and to love what you do will provide you with the energy and the passion to show up as a qualitative researcher. One aspect that I want to highlight is that I experience blurred terminology. And I think that students sometimes also have a challenge in terms of what term to use. Should I refer to the type of research that I do as a qualitative approach? Is it a qualitative design? What is methodology? What would the term method refer to? And this is also then confirmed by, in this textbook, the 5th edition of the research at grassroots, where Sefutu states that it is important to note that terminology is not used consistently by authors across the literature, and it can actually be quite disorientating for even the most experienced researchers. Several researchers and scholars in the field advise us not to get caught up in the concepts as much as the meanings at different conceptual levels. All these terms represent distinct hierarchical levels of decision-making within the research process. And what I want to highlight here is that we should not get caught up, but it is important then to make a decision on the terminology that you will use. And I'm going to share with you some definitions here. You will note that if you engage in Creswell's work, Creswell is using, for instance, the concept approach when he is referring to the 5 types of research: case study, ethnography, narrative research, etc. But Creswell, in his previous work, because I consulted the 2007 textbook, is also using the concept of approach when he refers to whether you are going to do a qualitative or a quantitative or a mixed method study. So you will note that there's definitely blurred terminology. So my advice is consider various interpretations of these critical terminology, then decide on what will work for you in your study, and stay then true to the terminology that you choose. This is usually also the advice that I give to my postgraduate students. If you decide to use the concept approach, use that concept consistently, define that concept, but make sure that you do not engage in fruit salad where you are using terms and you don't adhere to semantic consistency. In terms of the design, then, design is one of the key definitions of design is that it is a flexible set of guidelines that connect theoretical paradigms and can you see that strategies of inquiry is now used here, and methods for collecting empirical data. So in terms of this definition, the design can then be a qualitative or a quantitative design, whereas strategies of inquiry can be narrative phenomenology. So you will clearly see different ways of defining different concepts. But important then to note that your design will be influenced by your research problem, your philosophical assumptions, and then your old world view. And you will see that the way that design is described here, it refers in essence to the adoption of a qualitative, a quantitative, or a mixed method design. And if you opt for that design choice, your problem will determine that, but then also your philosophical assumptions. And we do not have time to go into the philosophical assumptions today, but also, as I said when I started off my conversation with you, is to say that your own worldview will definitely be also a strong influencer. A methodology is generally used to describe several aspects of a study, and it includes the design, the procedures for data collection, the methods for data analysis, selection of subjects, and details of the specific treatments. And when will it be important for students then to consider whether they are going to use the concept methodology? If you just think about a practical example here is, if you think about your chapters, because you are going to have your orientation chapter, and then you will probably have your literature chapters, and that might be 1 or 2 literature chapters depending on the scope of your study, or even more. And then you will have your methodology chapter. And in the methodology chapter, then sometimes researchers will opt to say research methodology. They will opt to say research design and methods. And you will note that if you use research design and methods, it's actually the umbrella term for that can then also be to refer to the methodology of the study. So what will then influence your choice of specific your design, but also then of your research methods? And again, I want to highlight, and this I adapted also from Creswell and Creswell work, your philosophical worldview is critical. So one important aspect then is make sure you understand the philosophical worldviews, the philosophical underpinning of your choice of design and methods then. And you will see that I've opted here to refer to qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method design. So I'm not following Creswell's previous way of referring to these as also approaches. I'm following his latest style, where we then, from that, there are various research approaches. And these approaches are then presented there in the midsection, and then that there are multiple data collection methods that you can engage in, and also in terms of what the method section then would entail. Considering one of the challenges of qualitative research, linking it back to the inductive stance, is then when can we actually say that we have reached an in-depth understanding? And how many interviews are actually then enough to reach an in-depth understanding? And you all know, from a qualitative perspective, we would say that data saturation determines our sample size. That might often be contested. I recently also heard a supervisor saying that you have to at least do 16 to 20 interviews to make sure that the examiners accept that you actually have substantiate conclusions and that you have substantive information. However, I personally believe that what is important is to consider then also the in-depth way of engaging with your participants. And you will see that data saturation also is not only a horizontal process where you have saturation of themes across the data sources, meaning that if I look at 10 interviews, I can say that there are 5 themes, and all 5 themes are evident across all data sources. However, that may often result in a thinly or an anorexic quality of data if you only focus on horizontal saturation. Vertical saturation is actually if you consider the richness of the data collected. If you have multiple quotes that would support a specific theme. If you have thick data, for instance, and it is in a way linked to the quantity of the data, the quality, but also the quantity of the data. Considering then the characteristics of these designs, and I have depended here on Creswell's earlier work where he actually compared these 5 approaches. So if we then consider phenological research and you think that that might be suitable for you, the focus of phenomenological research is on understanding the essence of an experience. And it's important to remember that when you engage in phenomenology, it is very strongly situated within philosophy. You need to, again, understand the philosophical underpinning. You need to read the gurus who did work in this field, and you can also opt for different types of phenomenology, descriptive or interpretative, and there are even more ways of engaging in phenomenology. I'm just sharing information in a snapshot with you. Ethnography is a very good choice when a study focuses on describing and interpreting a culture sharing group. And I have recently worked with a study where the researcher is exploring and where the researcher wants to gain a deeper understanding of a ritual of a specific culture group. And if that is the focus of the study, ethnography is highly suitable for this specific study because the student will utilize observation as a method to be present when the community is actually involved in this specific ritual. Also, this student proposed that the ancestors should also provide their approval for him to actually engage with the community. He described how that will be done. So from a cultural sharing perspective, it might be focused on an indigenous approach of also engaging then with a specific study. Narrative research is where you explore the life of one or more individuals. Case studies are often done by researchers, specifically in social sciences, also in business studies, management studies. And when we choose to use case studies, our aim is inherently to provide an in-depth description and analysis of a case or multiple cases. And this would clearly then have a demand on how we will collect our data and who we will involve as knowledge holders. Grounded theory is when we plan to develop a theory grounded in data from the field, and this is often a very suitable approach if a researcher argues that there is limited research being done in a specific field. And I can maybe share with you that I'm currently doing research on indigenizing research management, and there is very little done. There's actually, I could at this stage not find work done specifically focusing on indigenizing research management. So a grounded theory approach might be very suitable then for this type of study. Considering the type of problem, when we make a decision then what type of design or which approach to use, if we have a problem where we need to describe the essence of a lived phenomenon, phenology would be very well suited for that. In ethnography, we may want to describe and interpret shared patterns of cultures of a group. In narrative research, we may have the need to tell a story of an individual's experiences or a group of individuals' experiences. In case studies, it may be that there's a need to provide an in-depth understanding of a case or cases, and where in grounded theory then we need to depend on the views of participants. So clearly, I may not get 5 or 10 or 20 studies discussing the indigenization of research management. I may need to depend on more general literature in the field of indigenization, Africanization, management, research management, and then I would have to go to the participants and ask them their views on how it would make sense in the research management space. In terms of the discipline and background, so how did these various approaches develop? And you will see that phenomenology developed from philosophy, psychology, and education. Ethnography is firmly entrenched in anthropology and sociology. Narrative research linked to humanities, anthropology, literature, history, psychology, and sociology. Case studies widely used in diverse fields, but initially it developed within the context of psychology, law, political science, and the medicine. And grounded theory has a very strong roots within sociology also. Considering the units of analysis, so who will we involve to provide us or answer our research questions? And you will see in phenomenology, you have to select individuals who share a lived experience. And those individuals will be selected based on inclusion and exclusion. You will present exclusion criteria, but the inclusion criteria must clearly demonstrate that they share a lived experience. With ethnography, obviously, the group that you observe or the group where you immerse yourself in must share the same culture, and they must have experience of the phenomenon under study. And I've referred to, for instance, understanding a ritual in depth. So obviously then this participants must all be engaged in the same ritual. Narrative research, the unit of analysis may be one or more individuals. Case studies can actually be an event. It can be a program. I'm currently also investigating the effectiveness of Research Integrity Ambassador Program. So we are doing a case study of this program. It can be an activity. It can also involve more than one individual. In psychology, for instance, you might do a case study of 4 individuals, and each individual will present a case study. Or you might do multiple descriptive case study. In my master's study, I did a multiple descriptive case study where I engaged 2 management teams in a hotel setting, and I then did a cross case analysis to determine what was similar and what was different, or in terms of the experiences of a merger specifically. In grounded theory, we often study a process, an action or an interaction, and it should involve many individuals. So in terms of research management and the indigenization, for instance, I am going to study the research management profession as a process, and in order for me to understand how that profession can be indigenized, I will need to involve many research managers or maybe even researchers to provide insight. In terms of the data collection forms, in phenomenology, we often use interviews, documents, observations, but you can actually use art. And you will see that in my master study, I used art. I asked the participants who were exposed to merger and acquisition change within the hotel industry to draw a picture of the experiences, and you can clearly see that this is the pre-merger stage, the merger stage, and then the post-merger stage where things started to settle down, but they were also more positive or optimistic during the post-merger phase. With ethnography, you cannot actually do an ethnography without considering the use of observations. This is one of the key tools of collecting information. You can often use artifacts, and interviews might be useful, and interviews can be individual. It could also be group interviews or focus groups. Narrative research depends a lot on interviews and document analysis. Case studies, as I've said, multiple sources of evidence would be needed. And grounded theory, you have to do interviews primarily with up to 60 individuals. Then your data analysis strategies, again, I often see that students, they would choose, for instance, to do a phenological study, but then for their data analysis, they would not really consider the type of data analysis that would be most suitable for the approach that they have chosen. So in terms of these approaches, you will see that there are different ways of analyzing the data. And everything goes actually back to the philosophical underpinning or the paradigmatic underpinning of a study. And I note that we've got 2 minutes left, but I thought I'm just going to share with you in terms of the coding process in a very simplistic way, that when we deal with text, and I referred to the fact that we must be word artists. So when we deal with text and we are analyzing qualitative data, we have to immerse ourselves with the data. We have to read it more than once, and we then need to try and ask ourselves, but what is happening here? What does it mean? And you will see that in this specific text that I've shared on the slide, actually focus on a retrenchment process. And the next step is then to determine the codes. And I often say that these codes can be like the labels on a piece of clothing. So you will have a shirt, you will have a dress, but you can have different types of shirts, different types of dresses. So therefore, in one specific theme, you might actually have variation in terms of how people made sense of their experiences. And I'm not going to go into depth, but I'm sure you get the idea here that when you then ask yourself, but what is happening here, you are in an interpretive space, and you depend primarily also then on interpretations from the text. And this is just a very simplistic way of how you create themes in terms of negative emotional stress, financial stress, social stress, but this is very simplistic. Another important aspect to end this session with is also to remember that when you write your research report, that there will be different demands on you relating to how you position yourself. If you write a phenological study, if you do the write-up, it is important that you must present the essence of the experience. In ethnography, you need actually to provide a very clear, in-depth description of this culture sharing group within the context of this phenomenon and how it works within this group. In narrative research, you have to story and restory this individual's experiences. In case study, it's a detailed analysis of one or more cases, and it often demands that you do a cross-case analysis also. And with grounded theory, the outcome of a grounded theory would be that you generate a model or a figure or a framework. But we know that all of these other approaches will result or will provide you with the possibility to generate a model or a framework. And the last important aspect that you should ask yourself then, if I'm doing phenological research, how will I be judged? So what will the examiner consider when the examiner engages in my work? And some of the key questions would be for a phenological study, if the researcher conveys an understanding of the paradigmatic assumptions. Is the underpinning paradigmatic assumptions clear? Is the phenomenon clearly described? Is the researcher actually able to crystallize this phenomenon? Does the data analysis method fit with the design? Does the author convey the essence of the experience in the final report? And is the author reflexive throughout the study? And this reflexivity is actually important across all 5 of these approaches. With ethnography, an important criteria would be if the observations have been contextualized, and also then if a native view of the reality is presented. In narrative research, it would be critical to ensure that you tell the story, that you allow for restoring, and that the story should be persuasively shared. With case studies, you have to consider how you identify these cases, how you describe them. Is there a clear section on describing the context of these cases? Did you use multiple sources of data, or maybe multiple sources of participant groups to provide you with variation in terms of views? And with grounded theory, is the researcher able to generate a theoretical model based on the data collected in the end? And I'm going to pause here and share with you that I think an important take-home message is that if you are doing qualitative research, you have to immerse yourself within the paradigmatic underpinnings of a study. You have to make sure that you understand the characteristics and the assumptions that will influence all your choices from the beginning of the study until the end. And also, how true are you to these aspects throughout your research process? In terms of your language, are you using concepts like explore, describe, or are you saying that I want to determine something? because the concept determine is a more quantitative term. How do you position yourself? So very important questions, and it all links back to how you show up as a qualitative researcher. Thank you. I'm going to pause here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Retha. We're just going to go to our chat box at the moment and see if there are any questions which our audience asked during the session, and then we're going to tackle them. First, we have a question from Emmanuel Owo, is Prof. Emmanuel Owo, which says, nice presentation. And the question says, okay, sorry about that. The question says, any mention of qualitative data analysis software? What is your experience using them?
Thank you for asking that very important question. And I myself, I used to be a qualitative coder, and I fulfilled the function of doing co-coding. And important to remember that co-coding always demands that the student or the researcher should also do independent coding, and then you've got a consensus discussion. And this was very acceptable, specifically when you work with smaller data sets. But nowadays, it's actually advisable to use software. And the Atlas DI or in vivo can be considered, and it's also very helpful then to contact someone with understanding of these software platforms, and also you have to be trained. But I think it is critical. It's important for us. I myself haven't done it yet because I still depend on manual processes, but I'm also working with smaller data sets. But remember also, if you do, for instance, research for for a PhD, the examiners might actually expect you to use these software.
Thank you so much for that answer. I believe that it was well answered. The question was well answered. And we're gonna move forward with the second question from, it's Dolly Mafa, which says, okay, she's saying, good afternoon. Thank you for the informative session. You didn't mention anything about transcription. Is it not necessary? When and how best should it be undertaken in relation to CAQDAS software?
Okay, so that is the other type of software that can be used. I did specifically refer to transcriptions, but obviously transcriptions would be very important. And in the age that we are living now, there are actually software that can transcribe our data for us. Also in the past, what we used to do, we would engage transcribing services from individuals or from companies. But at this stage, it is actually possible to use specific software to assist you with that transcription. And I cannot specifically refer to the use of that software platform, but it is important then to transcribe your data. Remember that also, depending on the sensitivity of your data, if you, for instance, do research that is sensitive, it would be more advisable if you transcribe the data yourself and you do not outsource that. Also, with qualitative research and the data analysis, you are actually not supposed to do 15 interviews, then transcribe the interviews, and then to do your data analysis. The ideal situation is actually that you should do the data analysis simultaneously with data collection. So very important then to transcribe data. Personally, again, I haven't used software to transcribe data. However, say for instance, you are going to use MS Teams to collect your data, there is a transcription function that can be enabled, and you many of us are currently using a virtual means of collecting data. And for instance, MS Teams would allow you that function to transcribe data. I hope that I've addressed that question sufficiently.
I also think it was well addressed. Yes. Before we go to another question from the chat box, I would like to quickly check if there's anyone in the audience who would like to maybe ask a question or make a comment or anything related to that. I'll just give them the platform to unmute themselves and engage with you directly. If there's anyone in the audience.
Colleagues, you are most welcome to ask questions and engage with me. I see many of my colleagues in this room today. And the session was providing more of an overview, and we didn't have time to go into these specific designs due to time constraints, but I do hope that I provided you with some guidance in terms of how to show up as a qualitative researcher. Yes, Kevin?
Yes, I just wanted to ask you your opinion on this computer-aided analysis like Leximancer, where you basically taking the document, Leximancer picks up certain words and the repetition of words and the locality or the proximity of other words, and then classifies it, and that actually can be an interim step to getting a series of themes for the theme content analysis. Just what's your opinion on something like Leximancer? I know there are other software packages as well.
Yes, I don't know that software package, but I want to state again that software can be very valuable. And I think what is important is to just determine the validity of the software. And you can, for instance, do that by asking, is it used widely within the research fraternity as a way of making sense of the data? Because we know that there are reputable software packages. For instance, I referred to in vivo Atlas TI, but I don't have any experience of the software that you are referring to. But we need to engage and use software. It is important.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Kevin, for raising such an important question. We're going to move forward. I have Thokozani Mbele here. He says, thank you very much for the presentation. What is your take on including theoretical framework on the qualitative design? Should a study be embedded on the theoretical frame or conducting the study in the reverse approach?
I believe that that there's an argument to be made for both stances. I am currently supervising a student who is working from the frame of an ethics of care. And what she wants to do ultimately is actually to extend the theory. And this is also why she is then departing from the ethics of care. So I believe that when you consider your paradigmatic perspectives, you should actually also consider relevant theoretical frameworks. It doesn't mean that your ideas will not change and that you will depend on those theoretical frameworks. But in the end, it will definitely provide you with some guidance. It's also very relevant if you think about, for instance, myself doing research in psychiatric nursing sciences. For me to be relevant in my space, it is important to consider nursing theories. If you do research in management sciences, you have to consider management theories. So I hope that I've answered that question. You have to consider your theories. Doesn't mean that if you develop theory and you work inductively, that you depart as a blank slate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Retha. Okay, I'm going to now give the platform to our audience. If they have any more questions to ask, I'm just going to give them the opportunity to unmute themselves and engage with you, Dr. Retha. Anyone in the audience, they can just unmute themselves and then ask the question straight up. Okay, I don't see any more hands or people unmuting themselves, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Retha, for such a wonderful presentation, for a lovely engagement. It was a very enlightening presentation, very informative and very instructive as well. It was a very wonderful presentation that you made today. And I would like to thank you on behalf of ISCA and along with our audience for such a beautiful engagement. And without any waste of time, I'm just going to give you 2 minutes just to make a comment with regard to the whole the presentation that you've just did, and then just make a comment, just few minutes, and then we will then continue with the session.
Thank you very much for that opportunity. And again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. And I can only conclude to say that qualitative research is linked to the way you show up as a qualitative researcher. It's an ongoing journey, but understand the paradigmatic and the philosophical perspective of your chosen approach, and love what you do, read extensively. And that's all that I want to say.
Beautiful. That was beautiful. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Retha. And I can see there are more comments which says thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative. And Dr. Retha, I just want to thank you. Even tomorrow when we ask you to come and make a presentation, please feel free to do so without hesitation. It was very wonderful, and I would like to thank you on behalf of ISCA. And for those who want the presentation slides, I would like to inform you that you should make that request into my email address, which is masipa.nb@isca.org.za. And I will tell you if the slides are available or not, but you can just write straight into my email. And we do have our social media platforms where you can get sessions like this. And just to take yourself a bit step back and then have sessions like this online, you can find us on African Institute for Supply Chain Research on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube as well. We are African Institute for Supply Chain Research. That's where you can get updates on the sessions and as well as recordings of this kind of sessions. Without any waste of time, we're going to have our other session, the next session, which is going to be on the 2nd of June. And I would like to tell everyone to please embrace yourself, because there's more to come from ISCA to you. So embrace yourself and be ready for the next one, which is going to be on the 2nd of June. And we do have SCM Game Changer Series, which is going to take place on the 31st of May. So please feel free to avail yourself for the Game Changer series that we're going to be hosting on the 31st of May. So without wasting any more time, thank you, Dr. Retha, and I would like to thank everyone from the audience, and have a blessed day further. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Have a lovely day.
Thank you and bye.
Bye.